Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters around the world. France's Emmanuel Macron has taken a huge gamble calling for parliamentary elections after his own party received a drubbing in the recent European polls. That could lead the way to France's first hard-right government with numerous consequences for the rest of Europe. We're joined by Catherine Fieschi, the director of Counterpoint, a think tank with a focus on populism. Hello and welcome, Catherine.
Pleasure to be here.
When we first scheduled this talk, we're going to talk about the European elections, the parliamentary elections, and we're still going to do that, but things have taken a real turn. What was Macron thinking?
So I think he was thinking a number of things. One is that he felt that despite many attempts since his re-election in 2022 and his loss of an absolute majority in the French National Assembly, that he was getting increasingly stuck, that he wasn't actually finding the governing majorities that he needed to implement his program, and that the more stuck he came across as, the better the hard right Rassemblement National did. So he decided in many ways to address both problems, to try and shake things up by a completely unexpected decision and essentially force different parties to enter into alliances and to basically rejig the forces inside the National Assembly. And if anything should go wrong, to create circumstances in which the RN would finally have to be confronted to the realities of power and possibly discredit themselves by the presidential elections of 2027.
Okay, you're actually saying that he actually wants them in government.
I'm saying that, no, I don't think he wants them in government. I think he still thinks that somehow he is going to have a version of what he's confronted with today, i.e. a version of a hung parliament, probably with quite a lot less power for his own presidential party or party alliance. But he thinks that he can possibly pull this off, but create a situation in which the RN would nevertheless be pushed into a situation where they would have to, in a sense, come out of the woods, and they've already had to do that. They've had to really come out of the woods and explain what their program is, defend their program, and in fact, already start to backtrack on a number of measures. He's basically giving them a reality check. He's hoping that the reality check won't actually be that they have a majority in the National Assembly. But even if they don't, he's thinking that this is going to be the moment of truth, both for them and therefore for those voters who are tempted by them as a political option.
It's worth saying that there's been a pattern before in French electoral politics that with the spectre of what's called the Front National beforehand. If you go back to 2002, many people loathed Jacques Chirac, but they came out and voted for him rather than have Le Pen Senior come into government. That's brought, previously that's been to Macron's advantage. What's happened this time?
So I think that there are a number of things that have happened. One is that Macron never managed to consolidate kind of popular support around him. That's an understatement. He's in fact almost systematically alienated his initial support over the past 7 years. So I think that he is very much a lone political figure at this point. He has not created a viable party around him. And this isn't so much that he's tried and failed. So what I think that a lot of French voters and a lot of the French public, reproach him with is that he hasn't really tried to create a proper party around him. In other words, he hasn't bothered very much with parliamentary politics. He hasn't bothered very much with trying to build a relationship with voters, and therefore isn't going to leave much of a legacy. So that's some of the factors. You could also argue that the other very important set of factors is the transformation of the Front National under Jean-Marie Le Pen into the Rassemblement National under Marine Le Pen. You know, it mustn't be overstated in terms of their actual program. You know, this party continues to stand for, you know, French citizens first, very much anti-immigration, very anti-EU, etc. But nevertheless, they have done at least two important things. They have broadened their voter base and really attracted voters that would have perhaps more normally gone to socialist or social democratic parties. But because these parties have been in part wiped out in France, in part thanks to Macron, they were able to actually develop a program on welfareism, social protection, cost of living, all of the stuff that you normally associate with the left. The Rassemblement National has positioned itself on this. And the other thing that they've done, partly since 2011 when Marine Le Pen took over, is they have really toned down their rhetoric. The program remains the same, but the rhetoric has been toned down. Marine Le Pen, because she's a woman, in a sense, has liberated the French female vote for the Rassemblement National. That's quite clear from 2011, whereas there used to be a real difference between the way women voted for the far right and men voted for the far right. In fact, since 2011 and Marine Le Pen, women vote for the far right just as much as men do. They've changed that. They've brought on Jordan Bardella in order to corner the youth vote. And so in many respects, you know, one of the reasons why there's not going to be a reaction like 2002 with Chirac is because people feel, not the majority of people, but a significant minority of people feel that this is not Jean-Marie Le Pen's party, that it has changed, and that it is, you know, almost a party like any other party.
And at the same time, the coalition on the left is a pretty scary one for some people.
Absolutely, and the coalition on the left is made up of the radical left, La France Insoumise, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the anti-capitalist party, which is a tiny part of this coalition, and then the Socialist Party and the more moderate social Democrats and the Communists. So it's an alliance that it didn't emerge for these parliamentary elections, right? It emerged, in fact, in 2022, in those parliamentary elections. It was very fragmented over, you know, the period 2022 to 2024. And I think to some extent, this was the biggest surprise for Macron. When he called these snap elections, he really thought that the left were in complete disarray, that they would never unite under any kind of electoral banner, and that therefore he would have siphoning off all of those votes against the hard right. But he really miscalculated. In fact, faced with the possibility of a hard right government, the left did find an electoral alliance. It's incredibly, it's almost counter-natural. You know, they disagree on some real fundamentals, including support for Ukraine, you know, which is part of the rub. So it's a very shaky alliance. My prediction is, you know, the day after these elections, the second round, this alliance will explode completely. But they know that given the French electoral system, they had to make an electoral coalition in order to stand a chance against the Rassemblement National.
In a second, we'll talk about what might happen as a result of the Rassemblement National getting a good number of seats, and what that might mean in terms of governing. But I just want to get your sort of view on how big a shake-up this has been for French politics. I know this has developed over a few years, but now with Macron's decision, it really does seem that French politics is it's so different from it was, you know, a decade, and enormously different from what it was a decade ago.
So that's a really good question, because the answer, I think, is really quite double. On the one hand, you could argue that the shakeup is massive in the sense that the RN and the hard right are more powerful than they've ever been, that the left is more fragmented than it's ever been, that the mainstream right is pretty weakened, and that therefore you have both a kind of a fragmentation, but also a polarization, right? That has rarely been seen before in French politics. On the other hand, you could also argue that Macron's calculation in 2016, 2017, when he was first running for the presidency, his ultimate objective was a fundamental shakeup. And the fundamental shakeup was to create a real politics of the French center, which had never properly existed before. And, you know, the tactics went something like this, that essentially he would siphon off, he would blow up the left, the Socialist Party in particular. I mean, you know, in 2017, there was nothing much left of the Socialist Party. They were bankrupt. They had to sell their offices to pay for their campaign debt, right? I mean, this was the presidential party up until then. So, I mean, it's quite a colossal wipeout. And I'm sure that, you know, we can also see parallels in other countries that are things that are about to happen in terms of wipeouts. But I think, you know, his first point was, you know, take the left-wing voters, you know, annihilate that kind of left, and then gradually siphon off the life forces of the mainstream right. And therefore you would be left with a really important center party. But in fact, if you look at French politics now, what he seems to have managed to do is the very opposite. After all of these efforts, what we have is a big left-wing bloc, a big right-wing and far-right bloc, and really nothing much in the center in terms of Macron's own party. So it's as if somehow we've gone back to the future, if you like, you know, only in a situation that is more precarious and where the hard right is more powerful than it was in 2017.
It's a two-stage election process. I think you've got to say something a bit about France's political setup. The president has enormous powers and has to work alongside with Parliament. What do you think are the possible outcomes?
So I think the French Constitution, the French Fifth Republic Constitution, you know, was written essentially by two men, Michel Debré and Charles de Gaulle, and they didn't necessarily see eye to eye. Charles de Gaulle wanted to give as many powers to the president as you possibly could, and Michel Debré was the one who was arguing for, you know, more powers to the government and to Parliament and therefore to the prime minister. So the outcome is that if you read this constitution, it's very, very hard to make up your mind as to actually who's got the most power. You know, received wisdom is that essentially the president has full powers on foreign policy and defense, and that the prime minister looks after the domestic issues. But actually, you know, when you look carefully, this is mostly about what's happened in practice rather than, you know, what's really written down in the Constitution. So, you know, does
a lot of that come down to budget and controlling how money can be allocated and spent?
I think partly it comes down to budget. Partly it comes down to how much of a force for obstruction the president is willing to be. And you know, we saw this, you know, in France under the previous cohabitations in 1986 in France, when there was a socialist president and Chirac was the elected right-wing prime minister. Basically, Mitterrand sort of refused to sign certain things into law, to sign certain ordinances. Now, you can block for a while, but the fact is that according to the Constitution, at some point, you know, these things will go back to the National Assembly. The National Assembly can vote a law, and therefore you can exercise a drag, but you can't really exercise full obstruction. Now, the thing that's important to note is that the previous cohabitations in France were in a very different era, where, in a sense, yes, you had a president from one party and a prime minister from another, but you also didn't have this incredibly fragmented National Assembly, right? It really was a different landscape. So, you were balancing out two forces. What might happen after these elections is that the president will be faced with, three or four disparate forces who can't agree with each other in the National Assembly. And so,
just to be clear on that, you're saying that you think that the Rassemblement National might get a sizable number of votes, but not enough to form a government by themselves. Likewise, the left would have a sizable number of votes, but be too fractious to count. And Macron's own party would clearly not have enough to create a government. So a mess.
It's a mess. And I think that, in terms of anybody listening, that is probably the most likely scenario. I'm not saying that there is zero risk of a majority for the RN, but I think that what Macron is counting on, again, very risky gamble, but what he's counting on and what is quite likely is that what you'll see is, probably a large 2/5 of the National Assembly going to the Rassemblement National, a small 2/5 going to the Left Alliance, and then a smaller 1/5, if you like, going to Macron's party. And this basically means that he has enough power to have some key people in the governments. It means that the RN doesn't have quite enough power to demand a prime minister from their own party. And they've also been relatively clear. They've basically said, that unless they had an absolute majority, they don't want the prime ministership. They know very well that it's going to be ungovernable, and all they would end up with is being blamed for failure and for chaos. So I think that in that respect, what we'll see is a year of paralysis, a mess, chaos. But we have to keep in mind that in a year from now, Macron would have the constitutional right again to call new elections. Right. So it's important to keep that in mind, because it's not 2024 to 2027 and the presidentials. There is a tripwire there in a year from now, whereby if everything has been chaotic, Macron can turn around and say, I told you these people didn't know how to govern. Now let's have new elections.
Wow. I mean, what a gamble. What a gamble.
Yeah.
In the short term, what are France's needs at the moment? It's got looming debt. It's been slammed by the European Commission for spending too much. It seems to me that Rassemblement National want to spend more. What do the left want? I mean, what do you think the implications are of this chaos? The markets are clearly scared.
Yes. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that the RN, as I've mentioned before, have a really expensive social program that they want to implement. They want to raise the minimum wage. They want to lower VAT on all energy products from 20% to 5.5%. They want to examine rolling back of the pension reform, and their program has been costed at about an extra 100 billion, right? This is France, has already been called on for excessive deficit, right, by the European Commission last week. So, it's not doing well economically. And what the RN are proposing is more expenses. But the left is proposing probably what is an even more expensive program. Their program has been costed at a minimum of 200 billion extra on the current budget. Now, there's two things that are important here. One is that the RN are already backpedaling. The left are not. The RN are already saying, when we come into government, we'll demand an audit, we'll see what we can do, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite clear, though, that if they backtrack on everything, they'll be shooting themselves in the foot with their own voters. And if they don't backtrack on anything, they'll be shooting themselves in the foot, with everybody else. So they are a little bit stuck. And my sense is that they will start by implementing the kind of the law and order measures, the immigration measures, all of the domestic stuff that is probably very problematic, also because it's unconstitutional in many respects, what they're suggesting. But in a sense, it's dangerous, but it's cheap.
Can you just highlight what you think some of the unconstitutional policies are?
Well, for example, one of the things that they're proposing is, first of all, is to give priority to French nationals for certain jobs, as opposed to people who might have dual nationality. Right, that's one thing. The other thing that they're proposing is actually really calling into question the way in which one acquires French nationality, which is that France is well known for an approach which is the jus solis, in other words, determined by where you're born rather than where your parents were born or what your origin is from. They're proposing to overturn that. This is so foundational, to sort of the French Republican approach that they would run into trouble here and possibly run into trouble even at the European level in terms of rule of law. But these are not expensive measures. They are flagship measures that, we could imagine them really sticking to. The left's program is even more expensive, and certainly in France, I think it's freaking out businesses, even more than the right wing, the hard right program. But one of the things about that left is that it really is a game of two halves. And after the election, we're probably going to see the moderate left tone down some of these proposals. And also the moderate left will want to engage with European institutions. It will not want to fall foul of the ECB or the European Commission, whereas neither the hard right nor the hard left particularly care about whether or not they're running foul of European institutions, which neither of them respect.
I'd love to get questions, everyone watching. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and then we can come to you very shortly. We'll talk about what's happening in the rest of Europe in just a second, because I have some fantastic comparisons to be had with Italy. But first of all, I guess the most obvious hurdle to fall would be the policy on Ukraine. If the Assemblée Nationale was to get into Parliament, get a decent number of MPs, there would be a serious problem in terms of France's foreign policy and also European support for Ukraine in general.
Yes, I think that there's a couple of things here around Ukraine. It's going to be very, very tricky. The first thing is that, yes, the Rassemblement National, definitely doesn't support either, financial support or arms, let alone, anything to do with boots on the ground or anything of the sort. They are unreconstructed, pro-Putin supporters, right? This is something that, they don't like to talk about it right now, but actually they are relatively close to the Putin regime. The other thing that's important is that they're not alone in this disquiet about Ukraine. The hard left also isn't particularly supportive on Ukraine. In the electoral agreement that they have, come to across the left, they have renewed. They've sort of decided that they would renew their support for Ukraine. But as I said, this alliance isn't going to last. And if it came to a vote in the National Assembly, the hard left would vote with the hard right on this.
Right. I think you talked about the support. Well, obviously the opposition to the government's policy on Ukraine, but I want to highlight some of the links directly with the Kremlin. What have been the connections between the RN and and Moscow?
Money. Essentially. There's two links without being facetious. There's two links. There is the money. Marine Le Pen was lent money for her 2012 campaign, but also for the 2017 campaign. Her argument is no one in France.
By whom? By whom?
By Russian banks. By Russian banks, right? So not directly by the Kremlin, but the difference between a Russian bank and the Kremlin is pretty tenuous. So she was lent money by two Russian banks. She's gone out of her way to explain recently that she has paid back that loan. Not that it makes any difference, but anyway, this is the case. The second point, though, which is important in terms of the links, is that actually there is an ideological kinship here on a number of levels, which shouldn't be forgotten. There is admiration for Putin's style of leadership. There's admiration for this kind of traditionalist, Europeanist as opposed to EU vision of the world, traditional Christian values, the values of the West, and so on and so forth. All of these are things that they fundamentally agree on, and I think that the combination of these is something that is powerfully at play, both in practical terms and in ideological terms. So there is a significant tie there.
So in terms of actual impact on French foreign policy, if there was, we're talking about that we don't think there will be a clear government leadership, but if there was an RN government, an RN prime minister, how would that affect France's foreign policy on Ukraine?
I think that it would be hugely problematic for two key reasons. One is that any disbursement of funds and financial support has to go through the French National Assembly. So in terms of foreign policy lines, the president does have a kind of prerogative, but we're dealing with a party that, probably wouldn't shy away from calling into question that prerogative and actually rivaling, the president through either the prime minister or, say, the foreign minister. So that would be probably the first thing that would get held up, would be financial support. And because of the role of the prime minister in terms of defense and arms sales and arms exports, there too, there would be a knock-on effect, because the prime minister, if he or she were to be Rassemblement National, they could act as a very significant drag and block on further arms being sold to Ukraine.
Now, let's get back to what we were initially going to talk about, which is the success of the right across Europe. And we've spoken about how Marine Le Pen did in France, but where else have the right done well? I'm particularly thinking about the AfD, Meloni in Italy, but also the Netherlands as well.
So, I mean, in a sense, they've done very well almost everywhere, right? And, it's easier to single out those sort of two or three places where they came a cropper a little bit. So in Finland, they didn't do particularly well. There's a view that says that in Poland, they didn't do as well as expected. I mean, the fact is that, the Party for Law and Justice nevertheless came into second place, very, very close to the Tusk coalition, so they still did okay. Orban, Fidesz in Hungary, didn't do as well as expected because they had a challenger there. Everywhere else, they came either first or second. In these European elections, not to mention the fact that obviously in domestic elections previous to that, they did very well, as you say, in the Netherlands They did where they're forming a government that isn't headed by Wilders, but is nevertheless a kind of a Wilders emanation. And they did extremely well in Italy in 2022, where Meloni is in coalition, but where her coalition actually improved her score at the European elections compared to close to 2 years ago. They did well also in Portugal, and of course the AfD. I mean, that essentially came neck and neck with Chancellor Scholz's Social Democratic Party. So, as I said, really what we're seeing is different shades of the radical right doing extremely well in most European countries in these European elections.
So how does that shape European policy? I mean, EU elections were something the Brits were never interested in and really didn't follow at all closely. But this does shape EU policy on a number of key issues, doesn't it?
It does. The first thing to keep in mind is that, obviously for these European elections, elect members of the European Parliament. The European Parliament has traditionally worked on a very sort of broad consensual basis where the center-right and the center-left groups of parties inside the European Parliament always had a majority and were therefore able to keep the extremes both on the left but particularly on the right at bay. In 2019, the center-right and center-left actually lost that majority and they had to bring in the Liberals. The Renew group, of which Macron's party was one of the key participants. What we see this year is that actually, because of the success of these parties, in the radical right or the far right for the European Parliament, is that actually, if you take the center-right group plus these right-wing groups, actually they kind of have a majority in the European Parliament. In other words, given that the center-right, this is an important element of the puzzle, the center-right parties in most European countries have moved to the right on a number of issues over the past 5 years, partly out of their own ideological springs, but partly also because they felt they were in competition with the hard right, and therefore they decided to borrow, some of the themes from the hard right. What we're seeing in the European Parliament today is a center right that has moved a bit to the right, and then the growth of the growth in importance of these other parties like Meloni's Brothers of Italy, like the AfD, like the Law and Justice, the Rassemblement National. All of these have grown in power. So there's a tilt to the right, and that tilt to the right will have some key consequences through the European Parliament. One is on the Green Deal and climate policy, because none of these parties are fans of the Green Deal. All of them want a rollback on a lot of the Green Deal measures, especially, putting an end to thermal motors by 2026. They want to kick this into the long grass. They've already, arguing to kick into the long grass all sorts of things about sustainable agriculture. So the Green Deal would be one, where there would be a real impact. On migration and immigration, there would be, I think, tougher policies coming out and an extra focus on migration and immigration coming out of the European Parliament. And then, keeping in mind that there's the European Parliament, but the European Parliament can't propose legislation, right? Only the European Commission can propose legislation. But you would have the third leg of that European institutional stool, the European Council, where the heads of government meet, where you will have a lot more right-wing representatives, right? So it's it's not just a shift in the parliament, it's the shift in the domestics and then the shift in the parliament that means that, migration, immigration, rule of law, and Green Deal are probably going to be more driven by an agenda that's driven by the radical right than up until now.
I'm fascinated by the government of Meloni in Italy. She seems to be a very capable politician, also a pragmatic politician. And I guess it reminds you that nationalists are not all cut from the same cloth, and they're not necessarily going to cooperate either. Can you talk a bit about Meloni and how, where her support comes from and the kind of juggling act that she manages?
Sure. So it's Meloni's a fascinating character because first of all, she's somebody who people didn't really notice for a while, but actually she's somebody with ministerial experience. She was a minister in previous Silvio Berlusconi governments. So she's somebody who does have real political experience, in contrast, say, to Marine Le Pen, or let alone Jordan Bardella, who has zero experience in politics beyond debates. So yeah, she's a very interesting character. One of the things about her support is, if you look at, she's in a coalition with Berlusconi's old party, Forza Italia, Salvini's League, and then obviously her own Brothers of Italy. She used to be the in a sense the junior partner. She had sort of 7-8% with Brothers of Italy. If you look at the previous European elections in 2019, the League was on 26%, and Meloni's Brothers of Italy were on 6 or 7, something like that. And if you look this year, it is the exact opposite, right? Meloni's on 28 or 29%, and Salvini is on 7 or 8. So one of the interesting things that this tells us, one of the obvious things, is that these are communicating vases, right? They're the same people. The people who voted for Salvini got fed up with him because he obviously had no clue how to govern. He made a mess of it. He threw his coalition partner under the bus, called snap elections, messed it up. Draghi had to come in and kind of basically sort out the mess and so on. So he lost credibility, and all his voters shifted to Meloni. And Meloni, lo and behold, has appeared as somebody who actually has very little vanity. Very little ego, which is a very rare thing in politics, and even more rare in Italian politics.
It really does make us stand out, doesn't it? I mean,
it really does. Yeah. It really does. I think it's quite striking, the fact that she just comes across as somebody who gets things done and really doesn't broker too many shenanigans. And I think that for a lot of Italians, that's relatively refreshing. But I think that, what's important here, because I hear the comparison being made, I particularly right now in France, everyone is saying, but look, Meloni came into power. Everybody thought it was going to be a disaster. But in fact, she's a perfectly reasonable politician. Who's to say this isn't going to be what happens to the Rassemblement National? And the point is, you're right to point out that, there are different types of radical right. But my own personal sense is that there is a fundamental difference between the Rassemblement National and Brothers of Italy in terms of their the position of their respective countries in Europe. Giorgia Meloni simply cannot survive without the European Union and the European Union's money. And therefore, it's not so much that she decided to play nice because it made sense in the greater scheme of things. It's that she decided that she needed to play nice with her European partners because she really needed the cash. And in a sense, I think in the past week or so, couple of weeks or so, we've seen slight cracks in that, in that demeanor. She, at the G7, she felt she was left out of the talks between France and Germany over the appointment of the president of the European Commission. She felt that, people weren't paying their dues to her as the sort of kingmaker or queenmaker. She started talking to Marine Le Pen a bit more. So whether or not Giorgia Meloni has been defanged by power, if you like, or whether in fact she can easily turn around and decide that actually there's more to gain in joining forces with a Marine Le Pen. Time will tell. I still think she will be pragmatic.
Yeah.
But my bigger point about this is that I don't think that Marine Le Pen is in the same sort of situation. She doesn't regard Europe with anywhere near as much even pragmatic respect that Meloni has. Meloni thinks that, maybe from the inside, they can change Europe. Her and Orban and possibly the Polish Law and Justice Party, that you can actually be part of Europe and change Europe and make it more conservative, make it more traditional, make it less, in a sense, less of a globalization project and more of a sovereignist project. Marine Le Pen doesn't quite think like this. There is a sense in which there is profound resentment toward the European Union, and what she wants is a lot less of it, which means that upsetting the European Commission or the European Central Bank or whatever other institution doesn't really bother her quite so much. Now, it may bite her back and she may have to toe the line at some point, but I don't see her watering down her stance kind of naturally.
You've looked at populism for a long time, and you've got sort of fairly complex and developed theories on it. So it's very hard to get short answers on this. But what's shifted in these last elections? If I was to, we used to talk about the success of Trump and talked about Brexit as sort of marginalised working class voters who hadn't done well out of the upsets in the economy. But that theory sort of moved on really a bit, hasn't it? And it's lack of faith in institutions, frustration with government in general. I'm chucking stuff out there for you to tear up.
No, I think the problem is that I think all of this is true, but probably in different measures, in different places, and at different times. But I think if we take the European context more broadly, one of the things that's quite important and quite striking is that if you look at all of the surveys and the polls about the actions of the European Union, the last legislature, the 2019 one, the EU institutions feel that in many respects they have delivered quite a lot. Right? They have, it took them a while, but in the end, they delivered a good vaccine rollout. They delivered a massive recovery package to stave off the consequences of COVID. They stayed more or less united against Russia and in support of Ukraine. They managed the major energy shock that flowed from the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. So, they award themselves quite a good report card, right? But if you ask voters across most European countries, they don't see it like that at all. The question, if you ask a question like, do you think that the European Union helped or hindered your life or your context over the past 5 years, there's an overwhelming majority of people who say that the EU's done nothing for them, right? And however difficult it is to square with reality, the fact is that the actions of the EU can lead them to say, look, it could have been so much worse, right, if we hadn't been there. And that's probably very true. But the fact is that for most people over the past 5 years, life has gotten more difficult, right? And so it's hard to say, look, it could have been a lot worse than this, because cost of living, sense of uncertainty, looming crisis, and also, they're basically alienating often both sides. If you take the European Green Deal, people who are interested in climate and who support the Green Deal feel that, they've not gone anywhere far enough right? Nowhere near as much as should have been done. And those people who are against it feel that it's completely unreasonable and it's punitive environmentalism. So in many respects, they find themselves kind of having done both too little and not enough, depending on who you ask.
I think the scene at and I've forgotten the name of it, made the major French agricultural fair in Paris, was emblematic of that. French farmers have received more than anybody else, arguably, within the European Union in terms of subsidies. The whole agricultural policy seems to be framed about them. What's happened to them? And they seem to have shifted to behind Marine Le Pen.
So the Rassemblement National, much like every hard right or radical right party in Europe, has been very systematic in the way that they've weaponized the Green Deal. There was no obvious immigration crisis. And also Europe looked like it was getting its act together on migration and immigration with the so-called migration package that they came up with. Germany passed a law. France passed a series of, quite harsh measures on immigration. So given that migration and immigration were no longer the go-to issue, the Green Deal and environmental politics became that. So they were very, very systematically instrumentalized and weaponized by the far right. I think that in that respect, though, it's quite clear that it's not just the far right parties that have seized upon this. The mainstream right has also called the Green Deal into question, and even some of the liberal center. I mean, Macron himself basically said, we need to pause our environmental planning. Everybody, aside from some of the left and the Greens, has piled onto that bandwagon. But in terms of the French farmers, though, it's important to say that the prime minister, the current prime minister, Gabriel Attal, when the protests erupted,
can you just say what happened, because people won't know?
So in January, the French farmers essentially orchestrated a massive set of protests, blocked roads, demanded a rollback on a number of the environmental measures that were being implemented in France. A lot of them to do with the regulations connected to sustainable agriculture and also pesticides. And within a few days, the new prime minister, Gabriel Attal, essentially gave into all of these demands. So it's already been watered down quite significantly. In part, this was, ahead of the European elections to try and stem the flow of farming and farmer votes to the Rassemblement National, and it obviously didn't work at all.
I'd love to get some questions, everyone. Just put something down in the Q&A box, otherwise we're going to wrap up shortly. There was an article by Olivier Duroy in, I think in the FT, and he concluded it by saying, Macron has already started to weaken France's institutions. There's no reason why he should not be able to cohabit with Marine Le Pen. She should leave him to the state dinners and official trips. He would let her govern, probably for the worst. What's the worst case scenario then for France?
Oh, I think the worst case scenario is a complete wipeout of Macron's center coalition. And I think, worst case would be an absolute majority for the Rassemblement National, because there we would be looking at real financial trouble, instability, the cost of the debt increasing for France, markets being spooked. I mean, if you think that, France came top in Europe in terms of foreign and direct investment in 2023, I mean, that would be the last time this record will have been held for a long time if the
Paris Bourse is bigger than London as well. It was actually just changed recently.
Exactly. So, all of these gains would be completely wiped out. The credibility of the country as a place to invest would be severely undermined, and then there would be all of the the rule of law issues in terms of people who are binationals, in terms of expulsions. Just a real undermining of the fabric of France in terms of they don't like to use the word here, multicultural, but this is a multicultural country. And all of a sudden, several million people would be made to feel very vulnerable and extremely fragile, basically. So I think that this would definitely be the worst possible situation. But I do think that the second worst would be two very, very large blocks from the left and the far right, because this would really spell complete paralysis. I mean, to quote the article by Olivier Roy that you've just cited, I mean, that to me is he may or may not be right. But, if anybody knows Macron even remotely, the idea that he would just stick to the state dinners is pie in the sky. He will do everything he can to have a hand in shaping whatever mess comes out on the 8th in the morning.
Remind us of the dates of the elections.
So the first round of the elections is Sunday, 30th of June. And then from those elections, we will get the results, normally a runoff between the two parties, or if a third party has more than 12.5% of registered voters, then there can be three parties in the runoff on the 7th of July. And the reason I give this technicality is that Macron is very much banking on the fact that he will have as many three-way races going on with his party, so that people who are frightened both by the far left and by the far right will have no choice but to vote for his center party.
Okay, a question from Sheila de Belay. Go ahead, Sheila. There you go.
Hello, yeah, done it. Thank you so much. It's all absolutely fascinating. Can you say something about turnout? What was the sort of turnout in France for the EU elections, and indeed turnout throughout Europe? And in terms of the French elections, I imagine there'll be a bigger turnout.
And can you talk about the youth vote as well?
Yeah.
Yes. So in the European election, I mean, as usual, there's fluctuations between countries, generally much lower turnout in Central and Eastern Europe than there is in the rest of Europe. And this turned out to be the case. So, you're looking at the Czech Republic or Bulgaria, you're looking in the high 30s, if that, in Nordic countries, Germany, you're looking in the high 50s. France was middling, around the 50% mark, not terribly. It was very, very similar to what it was in 2019. Slightly, the youth vote was slightly up, particularly in Western Europe and certain key countries like, for example, Poland, where it was important to bolster the Tusk coalition vote in these European elections. In terms of the French parliamentary elections that are coming up, turnout is super important. So I'm glad you asked the question, because the higher the turnout, the easier it is to get the 12.5% of registered voters, and this is what Macron is counting on, and they're expecting a larger turnout. The dates are problematic, especially the second round, because school holidays start on the 6th of July, and the election is on the 7th of July. So a lot of people were planning to be away, but they have had record numbers of proxy demands filed. I mean, it's something like 10 times the usual amount, right? So they're expecting a turnout somewhere between 63 and 66%, which is a good 10, 15 points higher than recent parliamentary elections in France. So people know that the stakes are really, really high.
Thank you for that. Just the youth vote in France as well. People, and obviously people over 18, but I don't think have been voting much at all.
No, the French youth haven't really mobilized all that much. They did actually come out in 2022 for the second round and voted for the left and voted quite a lot for Mélenchon. What Mélenchon is counting on is more youth votes this time around, especially as he has been very explicitly appealing to the youth vote in the banlieue. He has been a very ardent defender of Gaza. He's very much playing on those strings. Some argue that he's really manipulating these strings and essentially appealing to the youth vote in the banlieue in order to come out in these elections. But they have traditionally been they've not turned out very much, but they have turned out for him, which is what scares a lot of people these days.
All of this makes me want to do a pop-up tour. Sometimes we do an impromptu tour, and we actually did one for the last French. When Macron was first elected, actually, which was fascinating. Alan McCormack, a quick question from you down under. Go ahead, Alan.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Catherine. My quick question is, do these increasing internal French tensions enhance or add to the prospect of violence or other disruptions to the Olympic Games?
Well, so I think that what we do know is that should the far right do really well, there is going to be massive unrest, right? There's going to be perfectly legitimate protests, people who will take to the street to show their disquiet. And then there will be a lot of protests, probably not necessarily orchestrated, but certainly encouraged by Jean-Luc Mélenchon and La France Insoumise to basically, stir up a lot of protest and potentially violence in the banlieue. And of course, all you have to do is strike a match, and then, these things easily get out of hand. They easily get out of hand in Paris. My sense is that, this would be in a sense to kind of goad the government into quite robust action against these protests, really create an atmosphere of illegitimacy. How this affects the Olympic Games is the question, is one of the questions on everybody's minds, right? First of all, would it be possible to change the Home Office minister, the current Home Office minister, who has basically orchestrated the security and the safety around these Olympic Games, for the past few years? Would it really even be conceivable of replacing him or, getting rid of him, regardless of the results in the aftermath of these elections, when the Olympics would be literally 3 weeks later? This is a big question. Whether they would decide to move to alter the opening ceremony, which is supposed to take place on the Seine, and has been deemed a security risk in any case, but would be potentially even more the hostage of security issues if there were, given the expected protests and possible violence. no one knows really how they're planning around this. And it always goes back, and this is just to give you a sense of the atmosphere here in France. People cannot get over whether there is a method to Macron's madness. There may well be, and he may be playing chess and hoping that somehow he pulls his pulls his iron out of the fire. But the fact is that there is an absolute disbelief in the country that he decided to do this now, and the shock is really palpable. I mean, I'm adding this because I don't know that I don't know that France has been in this state of utter anxiety and disbelief since probably 1968 and the last de Gaulle crisis.
Wow. Well, I think that's the point on which to leave it. It's quite a point to make. Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Fantastic summary of all the events there, an overview of Europe. Really enjoyable speaking to you. And no doubt we'll come back to you again soon. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone to listening.